Hello, dear friend. Thank you for hanging out with a couple of multiples today. We are your hosts, Drew
and Garden System. We are a married couple that both have dissociative identity disorder, or DID.
Our lives are both ordinary and uniquely complex. Perhaps you were introduced to DID in a movie or TV show, or maybe you have been diagnosed with the disorder, or you are a therapist that wants to learn more about working with a client that has it.
Whatever the case may be, we are glad you are here to learn all about the internal worlds that exist within those that have dissociative identity disorder. These worlds exist for parts when they are not fronting in the body.
You are making a difference by choosing to listen to this podcast today because exploring these inner realms is crucial to the healing process. You can help dispel myths about DID and help spread awareness by sharing this podcast with a friend or loved one. Please visit acoupleofmultiples.com.
In this episode, we are going to talk about exactly what internal worlds are, how they are discovered, how exploring these places can help you get to know your parts and your trauma history, and how these worlds change over time through healing.
Together, we can make a difference for all by continuing to educate others about the intricacies of internal worlds. Hello there, and thank you for tuning into this enthralling fourth episode with Drew
and Garden System,
a couple of multiples.
As you learned from our previous episodes, we are a married couple that were both diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, or DID. We each have our own unique internal landscapes where our parts exist when they are not out in the body.
What is an internal world, and how does one discover it, one might ask? Well, we feel like the best way to gain some understanding is to let you in on our worlds. We can't wait to share with you our own discoveries and what it meant for us as a system.
When you experience yourself as a multiple with a lot of parts, not everyone is always in the body together. There are many reasons why a part might not be in the here and now with the body, and they need someplace to go. The internal world is such a place where parts will tuck away.
When a part or parts are in the internal world instead of out in the body, these parts are most likely experiencing amnesia. They most likely are not able to recall what is happening in the present moment while they are in the internal world because they are simply not there. While inside, they are usually visualized in a certain place doing a specific something. This, of course, varies tremendously from system to system, depending on what their internal landscape looks like and how much they're aware of what goes on there.
One of the questions that my therapist always used to ask us was, where did Leanna go whenever Leanna was not fronting? At first, we didn't know. We didn't understand that we even had an internal world for her to go to. We didn't always know or see where everyone is or what they are doing while inside. When we tried to see, all we could see was blackness. Even though now we can see so much of our internal world, sometimes we are still left in the dark.
Something that is important to note here is that having a therapist or supporter ask questions that points a system of parts towards thinking about their internal world could get the ball rolling towards finding out more about a system's internal world. This leads to discovering more information about parts and ultimately a person's trauma history that is embedded throughout their world.
Absolutely. There is so much information inside that is extremely helpful in understanding one's selves. It's also why it can be very difficult to see one's internal world and makes it difficult to explore it. Parts may not be ready to share or have their section of the internal world known or seen. This is especially true of the trauma holders who are trying to keep the secret, secret.
Yes, my internal world used to be divided into two distinct separated places, meaning a group of my parts lived in what I still visualize as a house with floors and rooms. And there was also this place that I discovered later in my internal world that was a good distance from this house. It was across a grassy field, deep inside a dark forest and beneath a massive tree with barren, tangled branches. This place was literally underground, and I came to know it as the undead world. where a whole other group of my parts lived. I use the past tense because this group of parts, after years of therapy, no longer live there in that dark, awful place. It has been completely transformed, and those parts of myself have been liberated. But the point being that my world was constructed this way to keep the secrets of the trauma we experienced away from the parts of me that were living everyday life.
For us, we thought we didn't really have an internal world at first. We saw nothing but blackness and didn't quite know how to get there, really. Our therapist suggested creating an internal place where everyone could actually meet. And so we envisioned this log cabin by a lake with a forest and mountains nearby. We imagined a little dock that went out into the lake and a small sandy beach area as well. When we started going to the cabin, parts started showing up there occasionally. It didn't turn out to be a great meeting place in the end, but it was the start of the exploration of our inner world.
Yeah, when I was first diagnosed with DID, I knew there was a house, but I didn't know who all lived in it. Looking back, it was a slow, arduous process, spending time looking within and seeing what we could see. A lot of it seemed like dimmed, uncharted territory, and I believe this was because it didn't feel like it belonged to me. It felt like I was looking into the rooms of someone else's house without permission. And I know some of my parts would agree that that is what it felt like to them too. The information they were holding was supposed to be separate from me. So looking in to see what I could find felt a little intrusive to myself.
We can so relate to that. When we would start catching glimpses of the different places of parts, they would get upset and try to snatch away the picture to prevent us from seeing. The very first time we caught a glimpse of Jenny in her room was very upsetting to her. It felt like she just turned out the lights and plunged us all into darkness the moment she realized we saw her and her room. She definitely was not ready for us to be there. For those of you tuning in for the first time, Jenny is a little of ours who is 4 years old. She's also our gatekeeper. If you want to learn more about gatekeepers, check out episode 3, Getting to Know All of Yous When You Have Dissociative Identity Disorder.
Now, we realize if you are a person listening that does not have lived experience with DID, that you may be scratching your head at this point, wondering if these worlds we are describing are real or imaginary. And that's a really great question. The internal world of someone with DID is indeed experienced as a real, not made-up place. The reality is that we do not sit there and consciously imagine our worlds up. That being said, our world starts being created in childhood when a young mind does not necessarily understand the difference between things that are real and things that are fantasy, which explains why many worlds include fantastical places and parts that are rooted in fantasy. However, the trauma that led a mind to create this world and store information and parts of oneself there is absolutely real, valid information.
This question of, is it real or made up, starts diving into a lot of brain science about our conscious and subconscious mind. We can alter our internal worlds by using imagination, and maybe the parts created their pieces of this internal world with their imagination at some point that other parts were just not privy to at the time. It is more than just some made-up fantasy, though. Sometimes internal worlds were created by the abusers to make it easier for them to access the parts that they had created.
Right. I believe that a lot of the way my undead world was constructed and the parts within were actually programmed, designed, and stored in a certain way by some of our perpetrators. But that really is a huge topic that could be a whole other episode in itself.
Yes, it could be. We should definitely do that in the future. The point I want to really make is that our minds and our brains are extraordinarily powerful. The internal world is something far beyond just an imaginary place that we dreamed up. It is a place that was created to store information about what happened to us and to house all the different people that our brain created to manage what happened to us.
Yes, our internal world could be compared to an office filing cabinet filled with different file folders, all containing separated information, but stored in one place, the filing cabinet. Our internal world works in much the same way. For my system, the house, its parts, and the information they held could be pictured as the top drawer of the filing cabinet. And the undead world, its parts and information they held there could be pictured as the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. I hope that helps you find people out there understand a bit better about how the internal world operates and why.
Our minds are extremely creative. If you think about it, young developing minds can't always comprehend what is happening to them. The internal world is just our mind trying to make sense of everything.
Okay, now back to why parts of both of our systems felt intruded upon when we started looking within. These parts compartmentalized or stored pieces of trauma and kept them separate from us for safekeeping so that we could each go about our lives without the knowledge of all those bad things that happened. For me, I think this happened because the undead parts of myself were literally programmed not to tell, and information was stored in such a way that my everyday living parts did not even know stuff was hidden. I had a vague feeling that there was a lot of darkness within me, that bad stuff was there, that I was bad, but I didn't know why or how or in what way. When I started looking within, I thought I wanted to know more, but the feeling I got from the introspection was stay away.
Our therapist was very encouraging of us to explore our internal world and to find out where everyone was inside. It felt like such a monumental task, especially with the resistance that came along with it. We focused a lot on the cabin we created and tried to have enticing things inside that would attract others to come and spend time there, particularly the littles, because we all worried about them so much. We added things like swing sets and a gazebo near the cabin. Victoria was really the first to come to this place, and then Daisy. Victoria is one of our adult parts, and Daisy is another of our littles. Once parts started coming together in this one place, and we started earning their trust, which we will get to in a minute, then we started to be able to see the places in our internal world beyond the cabin. Apparently, Daisy had been living in a cave all this time.
When I was first diagnosed, I had already known about a few of my other parts that I visualized in my internal house. There was Ramona, who is 5 or 6. She is my happy, playful child part. Then there's Journey, who I used to call Karen because she was so annoying to me. This was before I realized why she used to eat all the food in the refrigerator in one sitting. Since then, I've gained an enormous amount of respect for her, and we are best friends. Besides those two parts, Ramona and Journey, I knew I saw cats, and I felt like a cat at times, and I heard the voice. Yes, this part was literally called the voice. The voice was ominous, male, and scared me out of my wits. Initially, when we started to look inside, the part of me that I saw first besides these parts that I already knew about was the Dark Phoenix. It was obvious that she didn't want me to know too much about her, and she came carrying a little, who she called Ashley. To me, it seemed like she was running from someplace, like a refugee, but had no place to be. I could tell she didn't belong in the house, and when my therapist tried to ask her questions or had me try to ask her questions, she just snapped at me angrily.
Observing the inner world is rather intriguing sometimes, and sometimes confusing when you don't know exactly what you are seeing. It was such a struggle to see anything besides the lake cabin we had created. Leanna was the next part to arrive, and when she did, we could see where she lived, in the mountains behind the cabin. We started to comprehend how vast our internal world was and realized that the larger tower looming in the mountains was what we called the Gray Tower. Leanna, as you learned in a previous episode, is a fictive, and that fictive landscape was in our internal world. One of the benefits of gathering our parts closer to the cabin was an increased level of co-consciousness between the parts that came. Leanna and Victoria were much more aware of each other, and with the arrival of these 3 parts, it seemed the invitation to come was reaching other parts of us as well. What we still didn't know, though, was exactly where most parts lived, how to get there, or where Jenny's room was in relation to the cabin or the tower. We realized we couldn't force our way there, because we did try, but she was going to have to show us when she was ready.
Great point. It becomes obvious that forcing is not going to get you anywhere very early on in this process. It seems if you try to force and push for info that a part is not ready to give you, it pushes them further away. In my case, the Dark Phoenix, who later became known as Feeny, was threatened to be made dead, meaning more than dead than she already was, like permanently dead, non-existent, if she gave any information. However, looking back, my therapist at the time used a few strategies to gain her trust, so that eventually we were able to learn more about her. These strategies included her telling Feeny that she was a professional secret keeper, that she was literally not allowed to tell anyone else anything she said without Feeny's permission. She engaged Feeny in conversations that made her feel smart and important, and she also told Feeny that it was okay that she didn't want to tell her stuff. She explained to her how perpetrators work, about their threats, and how they make others scared into not telling. Feeny's response was, "I'm not scared." Slowly, Feeny started giving bits and pieces of our story. This therapist of ours also told Feeny that she could email her whenever she wanted. In retrospect, I think our therapist could tell Feeny wanted to feel connected, but didn't know how.
I just want to take a moment here and point out the benefits of therapists talking directly to the parts. There are still therapists that believe they shouldn't engage parts, and that also could be a whole other episode. But engaging directly with parts helps uncover important information that the rest of the system does not have access to. It takes a lot of trust building to open up the internal world. Often we would catch glimpses of places and parts by accident as we tried to explore inside. Even though we had created the cabin and parts came to visit, they were still living in their old unseen places. We somehow knew that Jenny was living in a not-so-great place. It took several years before we finally saw the house that her room was in, and we knew it was a bad place. Kilera, one of our adult parts, wanted to go charging in there and do a rescue mission to get Jenny out. But Leanna stepped in and said that was not a good idea. She said, we didn't know what we were walking into and what other parts were trapped in there. That is one really hard thing about internal worlds. Sometimes parts are trapped in not so great places, and it takes time to do something about it.
Yes, as Garden System just said, you become aware that parts of yourself are not okay, and that knowledge is difficult and something you have to come to terms with for a solid length of time before things become more resolved and or start transforming or changing. For my system, this involved getting lots of different parts up to speed on our life, getting them oriented to time and place, realizing that the body was not back there anymore, and that they are indeed part of this body. All of that is a lot, to say the least. Some parts, like my Dark Phoenix, also known as Feeny, and the little she brought with her, Ashley, were stuck in what we call trauma time. This means that they believe and feel like they are still living in the same time and place where the trauma occurred. And Feeny, we soon learned, was our gatekeeper. She came into our awareness upon our venture into internal introspection because it turns out her job, the reason she existed, was to keep any of us or any outsiders from discovering what was going on in the undead world. She came from the undead world to the house to keep us distracted for as long as possible. And according to her, that was supposed to be forever, that we stayed oblivious. Her very existence depended on it, or at least that's what she believed.
One way our therapist got around this secret-keeping business was by inviting Jenny to come and talk herself. Jenny made it very clear that she would only talk if no one else was present. Our therapist allowed her to be the boss on that. I really want to point out how important it was for our therapist to give our little this autonomy and authority. This is a really great example of how a therapist can talk directly to parts, particularly littles. She recognized that Jenny was her client in that moment. She kept herself in her therapist role and avoided the pitfall of becoming a caregiver. But it still took a lot of rapport and trust building between Jenny and my therapist before more of Jenny's internal world became known to all of us.
Yes, our therapist showing respect for these secret keepers' jobs was super important in building trust. At the same time, the therapists I saw over the course of my trauma work pointed out to Feeney and other undead parts that came along the twisted, cruel lies that our perpetrators got them to believe. It slowly began to shift their thinking. Even so, Feeney felt the need to convince us and our therapist that he, the voice, was right and all-powerful. And in the mix of getting more information from Feeney, the voice and other undead parts started retaliating because of us knowing information. We were to be punished. The house was set on fire at one point. Parts were being attacked by other parts, and this caused internal chaos, which led to external chaos and flashbacks for all of us.
We would like to point out that as scary as the idea of punishment and a house burning down is, this was how those parts were trying to protect the system. They were doing whatever it took to keep the trauma hidden. These persecutor parts that show up to hurt are doing so out of programming from prior abuse. It is all about keeping the secret. Be quiet. Don't tell, because someone will get hurt if we do. And that was exactly Jenny's fear in talking to our therapist. Our therapist had to reassure Jenny that no one would come after her and that she was safe. Jenny was terrified for our therapist at first. In every session, our therapist would point out that she was still alive and no one was coming to hurt her. Only then did Jenny reveal the persecutor part in our system that lived in the house with Jenny. Apparently, all the littles had once lived there. Some were free and some were not, and Jenny was both free and not free. This persecutor part would punish Jenny for leaving the house.
That sounds familiar. Like Jenny, Feeney was not allowed to do certain things and was told to do certain things. She was far from free, but she didn't see it like that. She felt like she had status with the voice because she listened to him. She felt above us lowly humans because the voice had made her immortal. It was all manipulation and to keep the secrets. Really, the point of her creation was to remove emotion from what happened, the trauma, and to make her feel powerful for doing so.
Perpetrators sometimes intentionally create parts to keep the whole system in line. In Jenny's house, that was the Shadow Man. He ruled the house and hurt the littles in a trauma reenactment sort of way. These things are not consciously known or imagined. Sometimes most parts are unaware of what is happening, and when they can see it, they feel very outside of what is happening. It's super important for therapists to not jump into a rescuer role. It can feel super distressing to know that parts are hurting parts internally, as it is a very powerless feeling. We do want it to stop and change, but it is not within the power of the therapist to change it. Trying to attack it head on will just lead to further internal harm. Our therapist made it known that she was willing to talk to the Shadow Man and that she wasn't afraid of him.
The therapist showing that they are not fearful or hesitant is important. The perpetrators wanted us and still want us to be afraid, so we won't tell the secrets. To start loosening the hold the trauma has on us, we must start to let go of the fear, bit by bit. And the therapist can be a model for us on how to confront our internal landscapes and parts that scare us with curiosity and confidence, and help us realize the fear was valid then, but not as much now. We understand that not all people with DID are removed from their harmful situations while they embark upon therapy. But for those who are away from their situations and perpetrators, it's a worthwhile point for the therapist to bring up that harm will not come to the system or their therapist for talking about what happened in the past, now that we are in the present moment. Something to be mindful of is, at this point, most of this battle is now an internal one. a lot of it is reenactments of the past traumatic situations and relationships. It is important to note that some parts may have been programmed to harm the body or other parts if they told the secrets. So slow is definitely the route to take when uncovering one's internal world, reassuring parts and re-educating others that their job as secret keeper is not relevant anymore. A huge part of this process involves giving these secret-keeping, persecutor parts another job to do, something that is important to everyday life now. Feeney is now one of my fiercest protectors, and she likes her new job very much.
Excellent points here. It is important to not rush exploration and to check in with all parts as new places are uncovered. Secrets were secrets for a reason. Jenny believed the other parts could not handle the truth of what happened to us. Even when she felt she could share with our therapist, she would make sure none of us were around to hear it. Over time, she started letting us in one by one. The secret was an enormous burden for a 4-year-old to bear all by herself, even when she's been 4 for all these years. The exploration of where did Jenny live, to discovering the house, to actually entering the house took several years. Now that Jenny processed her main trauma memory with EMDR, the house no longer exists. We've mentioned EMDR in a previous episode, but for those that don't know, it stands for Eye Movement Desensitization Reprocessing. We will go into more depth about EMDR in a future episode. One day, we realized the house had been bulldozed to the ground. Sadie, our adult part, suggested to all the littles to plant a garden there instead. And now, there's a beautiful cherry blossom tree in the center of a garden with a walking labyrinth. This garden was our most successful attempt at altering our internal world.
This brings us to other important points for discussion. How can one use their internal world as a benefit in their daily life? And how can one create change in their internal world so parts are not in, quote, bad places anymore? For example, Garden System's house that Jenny used to live in, getting bulldozed to the ground and the littles planting a garden there instead. For my system, getting our undead parts to see that keeping the secrets and hurting parts was not helping. This involved the slow process of them seeing that they had been lied to. For instance, being so traumatized as to not have feelings does not lead one to being all-powerful or immortal. Not having feelings and hurting other parts internally leads to more pain and separation. Parts like Feeney had to see that power would come from us coming closer together and having empathy for another's pain. A lot of this change in heart and thinking had to do with us visualizing Feeney wrapped in light for long lengths of time. Her allowing this was her being willing to heal. Healing and changing your internal landscape to benefit your life now has a lot to do with you and the parts of yourself being willing. And it does take time for the majority of parts to get in that space of willingness, to not buy into the lies anymore.
It is not easy to change the internal world. We really want to validate how difficult it can be to see the internal world, explore it, and change it. These discoveries and changes took the course of 6 years to make for our system. The internal world is a very useful place to interact with everyone, communicate, and build relationships with each other so they can start changing all the ways that they have been programmed to think and behave. It is also useful to create spaces for parts to spend time when they don't want to be out in the body. Many of us are not interested in participating in work activities. Managing people's stock portfolios was extremely boring to the littles. Creating fun things for them to do inside made it a lot easier for Leanna to focus and get her job done during the day.
Visualization is one strategy that helps a system with an internal world to make it a better place and to remove or change the dark, scary aspects that were once stored there. We used visualization throughout the years we spent processing our specific trauma memories. To process our trauma memories, my current therapist also used EMDR. In short, EMDR is a way to reprocess traumatic memories and their associated beliefs with a trained therapist while being exposed to bilateral stimulation. Once my therapist and I had done EMDR on most of the memories that continued to bother my parts and I no longer have the same trauma responses and triggers. I still can recall my trauma, but the distress it used to cause feels muted, not emotionally charged anymore, and therefore less troublesome. When most of my trauma memories had been reprocessed, I wanted to change the way the undead world was visualized in my system, so it wouldn't exist in the same way. I felt like a ton of little parts were still trapped there, not to mention the voice, and through visualization, I was able to set them free and change the space completely. I believe it was the willingness of both my everyday house parts and the undead parts combined that allowed my internal landscape to change. I visualized our angel parts wrapping our littles and the house in light, protecting them, while more angel parts went into the undead world and spread light throughout it. Darkness can no longer exist where there is light, so it was an instant relief for all of them and myself. I noticed I didn't need to identify exactly who was there or identify exactly what was done in order for them to be free, for them to no longer suffer, for them to be reabsorbed into the light and be at peace. I thought I would need some sort of halfway house, somewhere for these undead parts to be so they wouldn't spread any of their darkness or suffering onto the house parts until we got them to a place where they could live with the others without hurting them. During this visualization, I became aware that this wouldn't be necessary. These undead parts, held in the light, would return to me what I needed. Anything that was a part of me, characteristics I needed, or anything that was missing that would make me more whole. The light automatically separated anything that was dark from them, so all that was returned to me was good and peaceful. As for the voice, the light removed the mechanical robot that we saw him as to reveal a sad man, sad for all that had occurred. I think the light helped this sad man. That was the human form of one of my perpetrators. Perhaps the light reabsorbed the sad part of him too, and the rest vanished where darkness goes, where there's no light. The light illuminated what was behind him. What I only saw as blackness before was indeed the dead remains of littles, of everything drained of life that the voice and the others were feeding off of. He was back there with all that was dead. Could he not exist anymore where there was life? The light made all the darkness vanish, and what remained was what was there before, earth. Slowly, we watched as the earth started to bring life back into the roots of the once scary, dead-looking tree above the ground. The tunnel filled back up with clean dirt and growing roots and green things. The tree above ground started sprouting green leaves and purple pink flowers, and the scary thorny branches became soft, droopy, weeping willow-like tree branches full of butterflies. The forest where the undead world once was also changed. The sun could be seen filtering warmly through branches of all the trees. The parts that were freed from the undead world were being held by the angels and were quickly reabsorbed into the light. This is the power that visualization had in changing my internal world for the benefit of my life after trauma.
Wow, just wow. That is really powerful. It reminds us of the light stream exercise we learned about in our own EMDR training. Visualization can be very powerful indeed. The light stream is an exercise where you visualize light coming into the self. I love the light analogy because you can't hide things without darkness, and there is no darkness with light, and therefore, there are no more secrets. For us, knowing the trauma, knowing the secrets that Jenny held is what set her free from the house. When Leanna finally came to the house and talked to the shadow man herself, we were able to see the man he was instead of the shadow. And once the trauma memory was processed, there was no more man at all. It is like he vanished right along with the house. We have the memory, but if a flashback starts to come, Jenny is able to say, "I'm not scared," and the flashback loses all of its power. Inside, Jenny transforms herself into a bird and flies while singing, "I'm free, I'm free."
From darkness and secrets to freedom and peace, this is healing, and it is powerful. So in summary, you may not be able to see your internal world at first, But over time, you can discover this inner landscape that you could eventually learn to alter or change and create a sense of internal peace for all of yous.
Thank you for joining us to learn all about internal worlds. In our next episode, we will delve into the more intricate details of internal communication. How do you learn to talk to the others in your system? How do you communicate with parts that are too young to read or even speak? How do you negotiate with each other when everyone has a different opinion? We will talk about all of that and how we overcame these challenges ourselves with the help of our therapist.
Thank you again for hanging out with a couple of multiples today. From your hosts, Drew
and Garden System, thank you for listening to A Couple of Multiples, the reality of dissociative identity disorder.
This podcast is intended for educational purposes and is not a replacement for therapy.
Listening to this podcast does not constitute a therapeutic relationship with the hosts or any potential guest speakers.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. We would love to hear what you enjoyed the most.
You can visit our website at acoupleofmultiples.com for additional information and resources, and to also subscribe to our mailing list to receive future updates.
Remember, you matter and are loved for being all of yous.